The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Welcome into my State of Mind here. I am Dan Yorke, and you are watching this broadcast originally on a Friday evening, and maybe plus some, because I know that the conversation that we're going to have this evening is worth a watch. Robert Sanders is a former board chair of the Rhode Island Heritage Society. He is an academic guy. He has his PhD from Northeastern. He's a former decades-long JAG officer. He has worked and advised in Congress. He is an advisor to the military on COVID-19, and he has a lot to say about what's going on since the passing and the tragedy and the loss of George Floyd. He has expertise when it comes to paramilitary and military, and he's a refreshing voice here in a week that we've done our best to check in deeply, if we can, to the African American community. So when we come back, you'll meet him, and I hope you'll stick around for the broadcast that we recorded yesterday afternoon, fresh for you to know. Be right back on My State of Mind. Welcome back to My State of Mind. Robert Sanders is my guest this evening. He's the former board chair of the Rhode Island Heritage Society. He's an LP.D, which is a legal form of doctorate. He's really got a resume that is a mile long to be able to reflect, I think, expertly on the issues that we're dealing with right now, including, but not limited to, the George Floyd tragedy. He has experience in advising Congress. He has taught at the Naval War College. He has just a long list of credentials that go a mile long and that wide as well. So, Robert, thank you very much for joining me. It's a real pleasure and an honor to have you.
We're glad to be here with you. And I add one thing, my current position, I'm the chair of the National Security Department at the University of New Haven in New Haven, Connecticut.
Right. So you're former Rhode Island and you're in Connecticut right now. So thank you for pointing that out. Only adds to the credibility. I know you do a lot of military consultation. You're a former JAG officer, decades of experience there. What is your what's your gut telling you about what we've been dealing with the last couple of weeks?
Well, Dan, this has been a very difficult time. Frankly, my head hurts and my heart aches, because this is just the culmination, and I shouldn't use those words, because this has been going on for a long time. And unfortunately, since George Floyd's death, we've had another unarmed African American killed, male killed. And this is a situation that we have to get a grip on. We have to get a handle on. The rule of law and our sense of justice regarding non-judicial killings of people who happen to look like me, because they look like me, must stop. It just has to stop.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's even hard to process. I mean, that 8-minute and 46-second time period, it is long. It is a torture to watch, and to suggest that even measures George Floyd's torture. I mean, it's a torture to watch, because we just can't even imagine what he was going through. And this one, for lack of a better term, resonates.
So this has been happening in the African American community for quite some time, and the Hispanic community as well. But this is really the first time that white people get to sit back and watch and see a black man murdered under the color of authority by law enforcement, real time in living color. And it's shocking to the conscience of those who downplayed, underplayed, didn't fully believe the magnitude of the problem.
Do you watch it the way I watch it? I watch it horrified. I watch it exasperated. I watch it with the officers staring into the camera of the standard by there with a nonchalance and an indifference that is is incredible. A right hand in the pocket that do you see it differently than I do?
So let me give you a scenario. If you're a hunter and you've ever gone out in the woods and you've shot a deer, when you come to that deer to make sure it has expired, to keep yourself from being hurt, you put your knee on that deer's neck and hold it down until it breathes its last breath. You just saw that happen with George Floyd. He wasn't treated like a human being. He was treated like an animal on a hunt. And as a result of that, you horrified, I'm horrified, but my horror is a repeated horror, a consistent horror, a horror that's happened before. A good friend of mine described this as the stages of grief. Well, before African Americans can get through stage 1 or 2, we're already back to 1 again for the next event. And it's been continual like that over years, over time.
Protests are happening here. The first couple of weeks the first few days were tumultuous. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, but there's a history of standing up here. There's a history of saying we're not going to take it anymore, and the nature of these protests seem to have much more punch, much more power.
Well, so let's take that from historical piece. Let's go back. Let's talk about a day in America when a group of rebellious individuals met with armed men in uniform, and there was a civil disturbance and civil disobedience, and a man was killed. A black man was killed. That black man was Crispus Attucks, and that was the beginning of certain events that formed the creation of this country. And let's go a little bit further than that. So let's talk about a bunch of disgruntled white guys who called themselves the Sons of Liberty, who went about destroying private and public property in the interest of having their human, civil, other rights justified, verified, acknowledged by their government, which was then the Crown. So that first event with Crispus Attucks we call the Boston Massacre. The second event with the riotous white guys we call the Boston Tea Party. We need to think about, in context, America as a formation and how things unfortunately have gotten done in this country and how we got there. People unfortunately pay attention to things that make them uncomfortable. And in this environment, white people haven't been uncomfortable in this way because they have directed the level of comfort and how my disturbance should look. That's out of control.
Hold that thought, because I want to develop that a little further. We'll continue with Robert Sanders on this conversation when we come back on Dan Yorke's State of Mind. Stay with us.
Tackling the stories and issues that everyone's talking about. Catch Dan Yorke's State of Mind. Log on to WPRI.com, weeknights at 8.
Back into my State of Mind here on MyRI TV and Fox Providence. Robert Sanders is the former chair of the board of the Rhode Island Heritage Society. He is an LP.D. He is a JAG officer, he is a Naval War College professor. He has worked in Congress. He's somebody who has got a resume, this long for this conversation. An LP.D. on the radio the other day. I had a handful of people, white callers, who articulated their already exhaustion with the protests, and the idea that the protesting is exhausting it just dawned on me. I actually talked about the Boston Tea Party, not with the specific excellent historical acuteness that you did, but I said, where did we get to a place where we think that protest is an abnormality. We got here this way, right?
We did. But you have to understand another dynamic. So in America, white rule, white supremacy to that extent, has a direction of covering, pushing, and allowing what's a proper protest by Black people to their conditions in America. And my protest as a Black person must be something that allows you to be comfortable as a white person. We have crossed the Rubicon where Black people have been joined by white people who are disgruntled in that direction, definition, and structure, and have said, no, my protest is my protest based on my conditions and my issues. Deal with it. That's uncomfortable. So as a naval officer in my career, oftentimes I had a saying, if I wanted to see another person who looked just like me, I'd excuse myself from the meeting, I'd walk to the head in, as in a ship to the bathroom, and look in the mirror, because that's where I would find another person that looked like me at the higher levels of meetings as I became a senior naval officer. So my level of comfort in being uncomfortable was daily. Black people talk about code switching, where we have to live and work in a white world and then live and work in a Black world. White people never had to do that in America. They're being moved to that, where white people are no longer going to be the majority, and the power structures are going to have to recognize things that weren't derived initially from their comfort zones.
Tell me where the dynamic of looting and the violence that we've seen. I got my own theories on the anarchical infiltration here, but let me not provide an answer to my own question. Tell me about that, because that's not just making people uncomfortable. That's turning people away from the message.
Without a doubt. Criminality is criminality. Look, I don't condone criminality, and I particularly don't condone criminality where people are destroying the infrastructure that they need to support their own daily lives. I don't understand it, but I have heard theories where, you destroy what you believe to be structurally connected with those who oppress you. And I get that. If you loot, well, some people have said, well, this is the only way I have a chance to get back at the man, so to speak. I don't accept those premises. Opportunistic criminality is opportunistic criminality. Destruction, well, I don't really know who caused that destruction, because there's evidence of infiltration of right-wing individuals as well as left-wing individuals. How many of each side? Don't have the numbers, but I know part of the initial arrests, they had large documentation that many of those arrested were not from the locale where the arrests were taking place. Now, at some point in a lot of the locations that switched, and you had more locals being arrested. I don't know what the dynamic behind the switch or the start was, but they're just facts.
I'm not asking to investigate it. I think it weaned itself away. Protests continue. They've been mostly peaceful. We had 10,000 people at the State House challenging the COVID virus amidst this entire thing, with hardly any social distancing, certainly some wearing masks, but that's the other worry I think that's gone along with the protests. But for the most part, protests have become serious, calm, compelling, and I think the message is getting through. You also have done some work recently on COVID and the military. Are you concerned about the risk-reward dynamic here that's going on in the country right now while we're in the middle of this pandemic?
I'm very concerned. You know, here's the deal. As an African-American man, I can do two things. I can be very susceptible to COVID-19, falling into those risk groups over a certain age, pre-existing conditions, African-American skin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, oh, by the way, I can be targeted walking in my daily life as a Black man on the streets of America. Both are dangerous. Now, which of those two dangers do I want to take on? I have to take them both on, but I have to do some reasonable streamlining in how I do that. I have to speak up and say that the non-judicial killings of African Americans under the color of authority is against the rule of law. I spent 34 years on active duty supporting the Constitution of the United States of America, and I can't say anything other than that's wrong. As susceptible to COVID because of who I am, well, part of that dynamic is because of how African American society has been developed medically and otherwise. You know, the first thing that was closed when Reconstruction ended was the Freedmen's Hospital, because the health of Black people was not a priority of the new government.
When we come back, I want to talk about you know, how this continues. And by the way, you know, COVID-19 might have been certainly not a component, but an accelerant in this conversation over the last couple of weeks. We'll continue with Robert Sanders in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to My State of Mind. Robert Sanders is a former board chair of the Red Heritage Society. Someone who's got me, I hope you, very engaged. Robert, this COVID-19 thing, an accelerant to what has already been plenty of evidence on video and plenty of scenarios that America has lived through here. If we don't have a virus, this is one of those, you know, hypotheticals that you can never answer. It's like, you know, sports analogies. When you decide that you want to compare generations of outstanding players in any particular sport, you could argue all night. You can't solve it because it never happened. But do you feel that COVID-19, you know, was an extra push here? The pent-up frustration and even the dynamics in the Black community in terms of the battle against this virus?
Well, to an extent, you know, I'm not going to label accelerant and categorize and say that's equivalent to catalyst. I won't do that. But what I'll say is that human beings who have been in danger and frustrated and to a certain extent trapped, pushed out of their comfort zones in their own lives for X period of time may react. You know, one of the jokes is that if America catches a cold, Black community gets pneumonia. So here we are. America caught a cold economically, medically, in a bunch of other different ways. And the American African-American community, the Black community, got pneumonia, dying at multiple times the rate, not getting the medical care. Some of that was across the board. I mean, that wasn't just Black people, that was white people too. But the end state effect on people of color was markedly higher.
Yeah. And that's 5 other shows. Thought on the concept, and I have a few minutes, defunding police. I think the word has caught everybody by surprise. Minneapolis seems to be trying to be, because they are the epicenter of this. They're really pushing that concept. But most Democrats and most city leaders, even here in Rhode Island, are using the word reform, not defund. What's your take?
I like the word reform better than defund. The crime rate in America, the serious crime rate in America, is at the lowest it's been in many, many years. It's actually only 5% of crimes are serious, felonious crimes. But yet we are still doing things like providing armored personnel carriers and other military equipment to police the streets. Policing the streets is different than fighting a war. The rules are different, right? We have ROE in the military context, rules of engagement. When the enemy is identified, you can kill them everywhere. Hence, bin Laden in his bed, attacked at home at night with his children. The rules for use of force that the military applies to police start at the bottom, and so do they in the police force. start at the bottom, where you are de-escalating and starting with the peaceful engagement, and you go up to the use of deadly force to defend yourself or others. And that's the only proper way you get to use deadly force. A police authority has license to kill. So how to reform that? Well, I still am aghast that someone is actually saying that a chokehold should still be a lawful use and restraint of an individual in a non-deadly force engagement. I find it anathema that the qualified immunity that protects police is not going to be engaged. These things have to happen. We have to do that. That's reform. That's not defund.
Yeah, no, I get that. And again, your expertise and your thought process, each of your answers, I think, is another show. I'm going to ask you, only have 60 seconds here. I'm going to ask you to do the impossible. Answer the question, where are we going from here?
Well, I don't know where we're going, but I'll pick up on where former President Obama left off last week in his statement, that the youth are the future and the potential, that they're in the streets. And I saw a YouTube of a young lady trying to explain to her parents what was going on and the frustration that she was under, but she was there trying to explain intergenerationally what the problem was and how she saw the fix. So they're going to be gone and she's going to be here. So my hope is, in fact, that while she's here, she will engage and reach across the chasm and continue to be one of the people trying to fix this problem.
Listen, your perspective is fantastic. I appreciate it, and I hope that this is not our first visit to Robert Sanders, former board chair of the Rhode Island Heritage Society. Thank you for your insight, sir. Appreciate it.
Good talking to you, Dan.
And so that wraps up our conversation this week on the aftermath of the George Floyd tragedy, but it does not end our focus on it and or the American ramifications of such. You'll probably catch a repeat or two of the broadcasts from this week on Sunday and Monday evening, and back fresh with new programs on Tuesday. I wish you a great weekend. Stay safe. Make sure you wear your masks. Good night.